Zoom recording. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. I am Zoe. I am the Admission Enrollment Manager at Spark Prep, and with me I have Corey, who will be the speaker for today's webinar. Corey is our co-CEO and admission of academic tutoring at Spark Prep. We also have Hien, who is, thanks to her, we have this event today. So thank you, Hien, for organizing this. The purpose of this event is we want to provide you with information, context, and how this pandemic has created challenges and also opportunities that might concern your application process. And we do want to give you the latest news about college admission in 2021. Yeah, and without further ado, I hand it over to Corey.
Thanks so much, Zoe. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for sharing your evening with us tonight. We will, as Zoe mentioned, we'll chat a little bit about U.S. college admissions, what has and hasn't changed during 2021 and what we observed last year. So I'll give a short presentation and then there will be some opportunity for question and answers afterwards. So the thing that we'll do today is we will have some information around changes in application evaluation, what has and hasn't changed. We'll talk a bit about navigating test optional policies. We'll then talk about building a school list, a new approach to activities, letters of recommendation, and wrapping up with key takeaways before we dive into your specific questions. So first things first, our application evaluation. This is the big question. How things have and have not changed. One of the big things that you may have seen, or hopefully you will see now, is that there have been, both last year and this year, there are tons of assurances from college. As you see here, colleges have been and continue to think really deeply about how this crisis and this long-term crisis has continued to impact students and the admissions space. And I think the thing to observe here is that nearly every university in the United States has issued some kind of statement like this and has updated some kind of statement like this for this year's application round. And the thing to observe here is that really colleges are trying to lead with flexibility and compassion. What you'll see as we go through today is colleges are really not trying to penalize you for what you haven't had access to or the ways that your life has changed. Instead, what they want to know is how, right? And that'll be our work within our application is to really show how your context has shifted, but not an expectation that your context has not shifted, because of course it has. So what has changed in admissions evaluation? Context is everything. So context has always been everything. This has always been one of the really fundamental pieces of US college admissions, is they really want to understand the context that a student is coming from so they can better understand how did that student fare within their circumstances. That is particularly true this year, right? That's particularly true last year, this year, and next year, likely. We see that one of the things that colleges are really curious about is how you choose to spend your time, right? How you spend your time and the choices that you make is what will be most heavily evaluated. What choices did you make around your academics and your activities? How did you account for your time? And how did you grow during this period? So these are things that even in cases where we have had a lot of challenge or a lot of lockdown or a lot of quarantine or a lot of chaos in our lives, there are a lot of things that are out of our control. They will want to hear about those, but more importantly, they want to hear about what choices you did make, what was in your control, and how did you navigate those choices. Academically, waves of remote learning have become very, very common, sadly, right? That is a challenge that we know well. So really the key thing here is don't stress out. Colleges know this, everyone knows this has been like deeply disruptive for students. We also know that it has been not necessarily uniform. Different countries have experienced different outbreaks at different times and have navigated those outbreaks in different ways. And so this has both been really disruptive and it has not been uniform. But it is something that is expected. Your GPA evaluations may have changed over the past couple of years. In remote learning, it's possible that your school moved from letter or percent to a pass, no pass, or credit, no credit. All of that is normal and expected, and what something called your secondary school report will shed light on your school's context. So really importantly, your school counselor is also going to have the opportunity to detail how your school specifically navigated the pandemic. So they will talk about grading scales and policies. You will have indication about graduation requirements, instructional methods, classes that were and weren't offered, any academic calendar changes that happened. So everything that changed for everybody in your school will be something that will be presented in what's called this secondary school report. So that context is going to be something that's looked at heavily by colleges to say, what were the exact circumstances of your school? AP exams, for those of you who know about AP exams or have been curious about AP exams or are taking AP classes, AP exams will continue to not be evaluated heavily, if at all, during the admissions process. The level of course rigor, it does not mean that taking an AP class is all for naught. The level of rigor that you are pursuing and can maintain will continue to be the most important here. And importantly, if you have an internet connection, the world is your oyster. That will continue to be true. We have all spent a lot of time online. There is definitely a lot of online fatigue, and there is a lot of opportunity for programs and access that are not geographically limited. And as always, really, really excellent essays will still be key. So something else is, where else beyond the secondary school report do we have the opportunity to really contextualize your personal experience? And one of the changes that has happened and continues to be true this year is the Common Application has put a COVID specific question as a prompt. And this is an optional question. The question reads, community disruptions such as COVID-19 and natural disasters can have deep and long-lasting impacts. If you need it, this space is yours to describe those impacts. Colleges care about the effects on your on your health and well-being, safety, family circumstances, future plans, and education, including access to reliable technology and quiet study spaces. So importantly, one of the things that you will want to think about is like whether to answer this question, right? Who should answer this question? This, in fact, is optional, right? So one of the ways that you want to think about this is thinking about yourself in relation to the peers most directly around you, right? Related to the other peers at your high school. Did your experience differ dramatically from theirs? Were there things where your grades were negatively impacted by a shift online or by variations to your academic calendar or academic progression? Were scores lower because of these things? Were standardized tests impacted and your ability to take those impacted by repeated cancellations that we know we've experienced in Vietnam? So if the answer to those things is yes, right, if there's any blip on your transcript that you feel is in part due to COVID and its impacts, this is absolutely your space to describe those things and really clarify in what ways lack of access to a quiet study space or lack of reliable internet impacted your ability to learn and perform well. However, if you have straight A's and you got all 5s on your AP exam, of course, COVID impacted you. Of course, they'll know that, but this may not be necessary for you to answer if in fact you fared as well or better than your peers directly around you. Most importantly, of course, if the pandemic impacted you in any sort of personal way with the loss of a family member or loss of income, any sort of serious illness of a family member, or many more personal things, this is definitely your space to explain those things. So what hasn't changed? What has not changed is that the college admissions process in the United States is still holistic, right? They're still looking for who is each student and what are the contexts that they come from that are applying to this school. And importantly, will this student become a valuable member of this community, this academic community? So the way that we observe that, and the way that college admissions often observes that, we talk about in kind of three big categories. Academics, this one is a big one, obviously. We're moving from an academic institution of high school into an academic institution of college. Universities will see the best predictor they have of your ability to handle academic schoolwork is how you've handled academic schoolwork in your grades and what classes you were able to take. So academics are looked at really heavily. And again, you can contextualize anything that is anomalous there. But beyond academics and beyond test scores, they're also really looking for things like leadership and character, growth and values. How will you show up to be part of that community? The way that leadership and character are often communicated in the application is through letters of recommendation and activities, which we'll talk about a little bit. And growth and values are really talked about in, or your ability to communicate those, your opportunity to communicate those is really in your essay, your personal statement, and your supplements. That is your one opportunity to speak really directly in your voice to the application committee and to the admissions officers, and saying, this is where I come from, this is who I am, this is what's important to me, and this is how I show up in community with others. So these are still the three big categories that colleges care about, and this hasn't changed, right? We still care about all of these things in relation to you, right? And all of these things we still have access to in some way. So let's talk a little bit more about some of these changes around navigating test optional policies, given that test scores are one of our big academic categories. How has that shifted now that schools are test optional? So we have this brave new test optional world. This is relatively new. One of the things that has been true is that this test optional trend was a trend that started far before COVID. COVID accelerated this trend pretty dramatically. So if you were aware of SAT subject tests, you are aware that that had a pretty hardy decline, and then in recent cycles actually were wholly discontinued by the College Board, that they're not even offering SAT subject tests anymore. And a lot of schools had already been moving to test optional SAT, ACT policies as well, understanding that those aren't necessarily always the best predictors of academic success. They are a tool to assess level of rigor or preparedness for college, but they're definitely not the best or a reliable metric in all cases. So one of the big things that is happening with COVID is that the majority of US colleges and universities have moved test optional for the 2020 cycle and definitely the 2021 cycle. Some are doing like a 3-year trial of test optional. So that will then be true for this year and for next year as well, that most schools will continue to be test optional. Others, like the UC system, have moved test optional or something called test blind, where they will not look at test scores, they will not accept test scores permanently. Those schools have moved into not considering test scores as part of the application. So across the board, there is less emphasis that is being placed on scores. So is this idea of test optional a trap? In short, no. These policies are sincere. Students who did not submit test scores did still get into college. So many policies are applicable universally, right, for domestic US students as well as international students, but the test policy at every single college does differ slightly. So you will want to check on your list exactly what the policies are and to make sure that you have a sense of what the requirements are for your given school list. And importantly, we do want to consider whether taking the test or not, or submitting your scores or not, is the right choice for you. So let's talk about this briefly. So the first question is, if you haven't taken a test, should you plan to take a test? In short, you want to look at your resources, your school list, your mock test scores, and your priorities. If you can, yes. The reason for this is that students who submitted strong test scores did fare slightly better in the 2020 admissions cycle. This could have been due to a lot of things. Perhaps those students also had higher grades, stronger activities, better letters of recommendation. But there was a correlation between student outcome and having a strong test score for outcomes in the 2020 cycle. So there was no relationship between submitting a test score and getting accepted into college. However, if you cannot take the test, for instance, if test dates have been canceled wildly throughout your region, or if it is not reasonable to do so, you live in a place where there isn't going to be a test offered, and you, because of travel restrictions or your own safety, are not going to be traveling into a metropolitan area soon, then don't stress out. This is exactly why schools are test optional, is because for a lot of students, it is unreasonable to take a test. For a lot of students, they have not been able to do so. So these test optional policies are not they're not like a shadow requirement of like, you must find a way. If you cannot, you cannot. If it's not reasonable for you to do so, it's not reasonable for you to do so. And you have an opportunity in your application to contextualize that. And if you can, right, then you should. That is something that will give you a little bit more flexibility in how you present yourself in your application. In terms of looking at your resources, school list, mock test scores, and priorities, if you feel like you have time and and your mock test score is within striking distance of a competitive score for the schools that you're applying to, and you feel like you can balance that with your other priorities, then absolutely do some studying, see if you can take a test when the next test date comes around. And if you are already overcommitted with activities, if you are already sitting in a really strong place with your application in your school list, if your mock test score is very, very, very far away from what would actually be a competitive score for the schools you're applying to, then maybe not, right? So those are some of the choices that you can make, and some of the considerations you can make in relation to those choices. And what if you have a test score, right? You've taken the test. Should you submit your score? This is the other half of this question. Overall, you want to look at whether your application benefits from the inclusion of your score. So if your score is in the top quartile for a specific school, right, that means above that 75th percentile or above that highest range that if you Google search this school SAT scores or this school ACT scores, if you're above that top number that is named, definitely submit. Then that is definitely, you are among the most competitive candidates who are applying to that school. If you're above that average, if you type in school name, SAT average or ACT average, and your score is above that average for a given school, you should probably submit, right? You are then in the top 50th percentile or highest half of students who are applying to that school in terms of test scores, and that will reflect well on you. If your academic record is a little shaky, if you've had some blips in your transcript and you need another academic data point to say, I am a strong student and let me show you, this is an opportunity to do so. Particularly if your school didn't offer anything like AP tests or IB tests, then a standardized test like the SAT or ACT might be a particularly good opportunity for you to have one more data point pointing in the academic direction. And importantly, if you do not submit a test score, all that means is that all of the other portions of the application will be more important. And so it's your job to assess, is what I have outside of test scores enough to really show and to demonstrate that I'm going to be a really strong member of this academic community. Another thing to consider is test scores are still often a differentiator or requirement for financial aid. So if you are seeking need-based or merit-based financial aid for given schools, similarly, you'll need to check into each school's policy to see whether that is a recommendation or a requirement, or whether they'll consider that at all. But that's a really important factor, is that even if the admissions side doesn't need a test score for admissions, sometimes the financial aid side rules might differ. Ultimately, what this means is that test optional policies give you much more agency in how you present yourself. So all of this is good news. These are additional choices that you have to make, but really that gives you a lot of agency in terms of how you spend your time and how you present yourself. So let's talk a little bit about school list and school strategy. And let me just get to my appropriate note spot. So without test scores being a requirement, what this often means, test scores were often the thing that kind of kept students back from applying to a number of their reach schools that they really wanted to apply to, that their application may have warranted anyway. So without test scores, feel free to take your shot, right? Take your shot at high reaching schools. Look at your GPA, your activities, your leadership, how involved you are in your community. If you feel like you have a really strong application otherwise, how high can you reach, right? What are the ways that you might show up to a community, and what communities might benefit from your particular application? And keep in mind that all other students are doing the same. Application numbers have gone up really dramatically. Like, a lot of schools are getting many more student applications, given that testing is no longer a requirement for this set of years. So what that means is admit rates, especially for highly competitive schools and competitive schools, continues to decline, right? They're getting many more students applying, meaning they can accept fewer and fewer percentage-wise of the population that actually is applying. Rejections are normal. You should expect them. Take your shot, also expect rejections. And that also means you really want to hedge your bets. Make sure that you diversify and balance your school list, right? We're not only applying to the most competitive schools that are reasonable for you. You also want to make sure that your school list is diversified and balanced. So it's more important than ever now to have a clear distribution, or a clear balance between schools that are probable for you to get into, that are possible for you to get into, and that are reach schools for you to get into. And you want to minimize the ones that are like highly unlikely for you to get into. Feel free to take a shot or two, but you really want to focus on the ones that are probable, possible, and like reasonable reach schools for you to get into. This year and next year, especially, and possibly for the future, but especially for this year and next year, consider adding another school or two where you are a really excellent candidate. Because application numbers have gone up, admit rates have gone down, as I just said, which means that even if you're a really excellent candidate, you want to make sure that you're applying to a number of schools where you're really in that top 25th percentile, or top 75th percentile rather, where you're in that top bracket and you are an exceptional candidate for those schools. You want to have a handful of those, because even if you're an excellent candidate, the rejections might still happen in that category as well. Consider applying early. So the trend has been, and we definitely saw in 2020 cycle, that there was a really strong trend for colleges and universities to fill up more of their classes with early rounds, right? So we'll talk about what this means and why, but essentially, colleges, something called yield really matters for admissions, right? That means how many students they accept actually go to their school. So the more students that they accept in the early round, the better their chances are of having a higher yield, where the students they've accepted actually choose to go. This is particularly true of schools where they have a lot of students applying early decision. Early decision is a binding policy, which means that if they admit early decision students, those students go. That is very good for a college's yield. All of that is to say, if that's just a truth that exists for colleges, we can actually use that to our advantage, right? We can use them trying to minimize their uncertainty and their yield to our advantage by understanding that applying early might actually be a really good strategy for you. So early decision and early early application rounds are not for everybody, right? But if your quarter grades are strong in your senior year, and your application is ready to go, you've done a lot of work over the summer, and you're really, and your essays are really shiny, everything is on point, it might be a really beneficial thing for you to push to apply to some schools early. Your chances are often better, either by a little bit or by a lot, in early rounds, and you'll get decisions back sooner. This means that if you get some decisions back by mid-December of the application cycle or of your senior year, you then can make choices around your regular decision. Do you still need to apply to the additional 3, 5, 10 schools that were on your list? Or if you have one acceptance or two acceptances that are EA and not ED, that might mean that you don't need to apply to some other schools if you'd prefer to go to some the schools you've already gotten into. So that can minimize some of the work ahead. It can minimize the cost of application fees, and that allows you to, again, have a little bit more flexibility, choice, confidence that you've already gotten into a school early. And early decision is definitely not for everybody. Early decision is if and only if you are very confident that that is the one school, that if that is the that if you get into that school, you are definitely committed to going. This does bank a lot on financial aid, right? If students really need a lot of financial aid support, it's often better to have more flexibility, to not have a binding decision where you might get a lot of financial aid offers and you then get to make choices around how to navigate and what's best for you and your family. Early decision, if financial aid isn't a consideration, and if you are really confident that you love a school and you're very sure that that's going to be a great place for you, and you're prepared, and your early senior year grades are very strong, then applying early is definitely an advantageous thing. Okay, so let's shift. So we've talked a little bit about applications overall. We've talked a little bit about how testing has impacted admissions and not. We've talked a little bit about what that means for school list and how you can optimize your strategy. Now, our last two areas are two of these other pie pieces, right? Activities and letters of recommendation. So let's first talk about activities. So one of the big things that we hear a lot from students is that this has been a really stressful time. A lot of activities have been canceled. A lot of things that they would have done aren't available to them. That is very understandable. And I want to reiterate that colleges are not looking to penalize you for what you did not have access to. If you didn't have access to it, it's not your fault, right? And this is also an opportunity for us to really do some soul searching, to move away from like the checkbox syndrome of what can I do to put on my resume, and this kind of like productivity theater of the more you're doing, the more valuable it is. No, actually, right? When we have a lot of things stripped away from us, and when we have when we don't actually have access to a lot of things that we've done in the past, it is an opportunity to pause and reflect on like what actually does matter to you. What do you want to be spending your time on, and what feels valuable for you to be spending your time on? So similarly, this again is coming back to this question of like, what do you do with your time when the time is yours, right? How have you made those choices and directed your experience where you can? So this can look like a lot of things. This can be engagement with your community, with your intellect, with the world, with yourself. This is not going to look and should not look the same for you as it does for everybody else. How can you build? How can you create something? How can you learn something new? It could be a matter of developing skills, like working on your writing skills, which are very important for your essays and in college, right? Especially liberal arts programs are, writing is huge, and you will need to work on writing. So writing skills are huge. How can you develop your writing and reading skills? Your technical skills, maybe your creative skills, maybe your language skills, English or otherwise. It might be an opportunity to emphasize and prioritize connection, maybe with your family or heritage, siblings, your immediate community. One way to think about this is, what would you have done, or what would you be doing without any restrictions, right? What would you have chosen to do this summer or last spring when a lot of things were locked down? And instead of just the task, right, instead of just the club name or just the program name or just the thing, what did you hope to gain from that? Right? Were you hoping for to meet new people? Were you hoping to learn something new? Were you hoping to deepen your understanding of a particular thing? And how can you replicate that feeling, that experience that you were seeking in other ways? So, for instance, right, there is an example of this could be, let's say that you had some dream of doing like a culinary program in France, right? And let's say that whether this was something that was planned and canceled or whether this is just a dream for you anyway, let's say that this is a dream of yours, right? What did you hope to gain? Were you hoping for an international experience, connecting with people from communities that are different than yours? Were you hoping for to build up your cooking and culinary skills? Were you hoping for a different cultural experience? And then how can you replicate those things, right? Maybe you collect recipes from French masters, right? Maybe you reach out to, you talk to friends and family members and any contacts that you have to say, what international contacts do I have? Maybe can I ask for recipes from friends of friends from other places and try them out myself? Create a little culinary curriculum for yourself. Maybe plan to cook a meal once weekly for your family or for a neighbor who would appreciate that or needs that, right? Is there someone in your community who actually could really benefit from having a meal cooked for them? Right. So is that some fancy culinary program in France? No, but is that gaining connection to others and developing skills and maybe like focusing on a different form of community that might still be deeply valuable, that was guided by your own curiosity and the things that you were looking to develop, right? That's what we have the opportunity to do. Do continue to expect a certain level of continued uncertainty. Practice flexibility, right? Certain things might continue to bump in person, then back online, then in person, then back online. As much as possible, keep your eyes oriented towards what were you hoping to gain from that? How did you hope to feel about that? And how can you, if there were really social events that are getting canceled, how can you still create kind of like social experiences from afar if needed? And I think one of the big opportunities we have in thinking about activities or resume or anything is anticipate this next phase of the world and the need that we will have. Inequity is enormous right now. Service will never have been more important, right? There's so much need in the world, and there is so much that is happening in the world, and so much that the world needs you, right? How do you want to show up? Is it in an academic way? Is it in a way of service? And how can you think about what you care about to guide the choices that you can make in some small but doable ways that you can engage with those things now? Great. Let's move on to landing strong letters of recommendation. So as you remember from our pie chart, letters of recommendation is one of the ways that we can really demonstrate leadership and character. Activities was one way that we just talked about. Letters of recommendation are another. So what's the function of letters of recommendation? I feel like this is often an area that is not as heavily emphasized in terms of planning for or considering. Letters of recommendation are where an academic professional in your world, your teachers, your counselor, et cetera, are speaking to another academic professional on the admissions committee about how you show up in community, right? What kind of person does it feel like to have you in a room? And that can be challenging, right? This can be a challenging thing, particularly when things have gone from remote to not to back. They're both very important because they can speak to your strengths in a really important way from a voice that's not yours. And they can be tricky when they're remote. So it is harder to naturally build strong relationships when there's a lot of fluctuation and chaos in school programs, et cetera. But some effort and investment can really go a long way. So one of the ways that that effort can show up is just maintaining really strong investment of classes, right? So showing up to do your homework, showing up for classes, really participating. Look for opportunities for connection and engagement with your teachers. This might look like just even thinking about like, who are the teachers who see you already in a particularly strong light? Which teachers do you gravitate towards? Which teachers do you maybe have a similar personality to, or do you respect a lot, or similar academic interests? Participate in class, seek additional support if you need it, right? Sometimes really strong letters of recommendation don't come from teachers where you were the star of the class, but actually the classes where you were really struggling, but you showed up, you went in for additional support, you like went above and beyond to really understand the material, and you really improved, right? Maybe it wasn't your highest grade, but you really invested a lot, and that teacher saw you show up over and over and over again to invest in yourself. Seek additional meetings. Ask them for book recommendations on topics you care about. Talk to them about subjects that might be interesting to both of you. And these are ways that with some intention, you actually can guide some of those relationships that might have more organically happened if there were no disruptions in our academic trajectories. So ideally, letters will communicate that you are mature, that you're superlative, that you've gone above and beyond in particularly in challenging times. So what are our key takeaways? The first key takeaway is that more is the same than not, right? More is there is less that has shifted in the college admissions process than has stayed the same, right? The big thing that has stayed the same is that colleges are looking for building a community and building an academic community where participants are diverse and where participants can contribute intellectually, socially, they can contribute to their communities, they can contribute in service, they can contribute with art, right? In what ways can they make their communities really rich and thriving? How they look for that is academically, can we make sure that this is an appropriate academic fit for you? Leadership and character through recommendations and activities of how can we understand the way that you show up and the way that you step up maybe and take ownership for yourself and maybe lead others. And how have you grown, right? Something we didn't talk a lot about is essays and supplements, but essays are really key and deep development on thinking about the ways that you've grown the most over time and really crafting excellent essays so that your authentic voice comes through are the ways that we really see who you are in the application and this snapshot of you, right? It can't be the whole scrapbook of your life, but it is a snapshot, right? With activities, recommendation letters, essays, your grade, your transcripts, potentially your test scores. We ideally want all of that to not be the whole picture. Of course, it can't be the whole picture of you, but it should still be and can still be a representative snapshot of the things that are most important to you, who you are, where you've came from, what your current circumstances are, and how you plan to show up in future communities. So by and large, schools are trying to lead with flexibility and compassion. They're not going to penalize you for things that were out of your control. Context will be key across the board. They'll get context from your secondary school report. You have an opportunity to show context in a variety of ways. Take advantage of the resources that are available to you. And again, you will not be penalized for resources that you did not have access to. Test optional policies. These actually give you more flexibility in both your testing strategy, whether to take a test, whether to submit a test score that you have taken, and building your school list. If you can prepare to take an SAT or ACT at least once, you should do so. And there are very valid reasons to choose not to continue to prepare for the SAT or ACT, or not to take it or not to submit. If you have a test score, consider whether it strengthens your profile or whether it actually raises questions in your profile. And fundamentally, continue to use this as an opportunity to make choices about what you can and want to prioritize for yourself. This will continue to be true in all areas of your life, and in all phases of the world. But this is a great moment when there is so much uncertainty, to pause and get off some of the treadmills that we're on and reflect where you've come from, where you're going, why you want to head in the direction that you want to head, what choices are you making today and tomorrow and this week about your activities and your choices. And in terms of your application, you can absolutely make a case for why those choices made sense for you. There is no right or wrong. There is no ideal activities list. There is no ideal essay. There are characteristics of those things that make those strong. And that is really like deep commitment to yourself and authenticity, and deep care in crafting those things and in crafting your journey in the way that's most valuable for you. If you do so, that then will reflect in your application. And fundamentally, you've got this, and good luck for wherever you are in your journey. We are here to answer questions. We are here to guide you and help you along the way, possibly. And I hope that this was at least some starting information for what is helpful, what has and hasn't shifted in the past year or two. So let me actually kick this back over to Zoe and Hien for Q&A. Do you all want to guide where we are for some of our submitted questions early, and potentially any new questions that participants have?
Yeah, sure. So from everyone's registration form, we have a lot of interesting questions from our students, and we have handpicked a few to ask Corey. And if you in the audience today have more questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A box. We will be answering them live. So yeah, the first question we have is how to build a consistent image of ourselves through the extracurricular profile. The students said, I have done a lot. I love all the programs I have joined, but I don't know how to really convey myself through those activities.
Yeah, thanks, Zoe, and thanks to the student who submitted this question. That's a really great question. There's a couple answers to this, right? The first is in your activities list on your Common App, if that is that is likely one of the applications that you'll need to fill out, if not the only application you'll need to fill out. Through the Common App, you have the opportunity to select 10 activities. So you may have done many more, you may have done fewer than 10, but you have the opportunity to select 10. And part of the function of that is for you to distill for the admissions committee what has been most important to you. So I'm going to turn that question on its head. It's actually less like what is most impressive or how can I make the image for others? What is most important to you, right? What have been the things that are most meaningful, that you've invested the most time in? Those are the ones to really highlight in the application. There are some theories of thought of whether we want to guide students to being really well-rounded in activities, doing many types of different things, or whether you want kind of like a pointy applicant who's done a lot of one thing. Both are really valid as long as the investment is genuine, right? As long as the investment is real in where you've spent your time. If you happen to have done a lot in, let's say, visual arts and theater, and you are like really interested in computer science and have done a lot of coding, there's no need to omit important parts of yourself from your application. In fact, it might be really interesting that you've done theater and you also are really interested in coding, right? But what you don't necessarily want to do is do a little bit of everything just to have a ton on your resume, right? That kind of a surface level investment isn't super interesting, probably for you, and definitely not for admissions, right? Showing up to one meeting a year for 100 clubs is less interesting than showing up to a handful of things more consistently. Whether that handful of things is like a consistent image or not, it doesn't really matter, right? Like, we are complex people and we have complex interests. And so if your interests are far reaching. Awesome. Good for you, right? Highlight which ones feel most important to you. Highlight which ones might be most relevant to potential courses of study that you might want to pursue, or highlight the ones that indicate activities that you might continue to pursue in college, right? You want to think about the application as basically being the bridge of here's what I've done to help them predict what you will do, right? So if you've done a lot that you're like, I actually hated that and I don't want to do that in college, if then maybe don't include it, right? That might not be a super critical component to include in your application. If you have a lot of other things that were really meaningful, that you spent good time on, that you grew a lot from, and that you would love to continue doing in college, that's maybe the set of things that you can guide forward. On the other hand, if you do have one interest or two interests that you've done a ton on, and you've gone really deep, and you've done a million coding camps, and you've done a lot of work for kind of like one area, then the way to diversify is not by forcing yourself to move outside of that topic, but thinking about how can you use your involvement in that topic to grow different parts of yourself, right? Is there a way where you can have that be interactive with others, where you can really push yourself to understand it intellectually better? Maybe there's a Coursera class or a program that you take to really develop those skills. Maybe you use it to serve others, right? Is there a way that you can, one of our students just used their passion to, or a set of students actually just used their interest in coding to create a camp for others, for other kids who were interested in learning. So there is still diversity and experience that can happen, even within a narrow, even within a really narrow set of interests. And that can still actually show a lot of facets of your personality, even with like one interest. So I answered a little bit maybe beyond that question, but hope that felt helpful.
No, it was great. Thank you, Corey. And the next question, we do have a